Welcome everyone to CG seminar stroke webinar number 287. And we're going to be looking at student mobility and the transformations of higher education systems in France and the UK since the 1920s. So this is an historical webinar, but the data are very interesting. Our presenter is Vincent Carpentier. I'm going to introduce Vincent in a moment, but let me first take you through the webinar protocols. Well, remember that the webinar is being recorded and will be posted online on the CG website and the YouTube channel in due course, meaning usually within the next 24 hours or so. A transcript of the chat function from today's discussion will also be posted on the CG website. Now, during the webinar, please keep yourself muted unless you've been asked to speak or ask a question. We find that extraneous noise can sometimes stop the webinar, so quite important to stay muted until you're needed. No need to turn your camera on either. You can leave your video off. But of course, we'd like you to turn on both your audio and your video when you take part in the Q&A section of the webinar. We recommend using speaker view so you can more clearly see who is talking at any given moment. To ask a question, develop your question or your statement in the chat, and then I'll select you into the Q&A part of the webinar, which starts about halfway through, on the basis of what's coming forward in the chat. If you're asked to enter the Q&A, and I'll usually be able to send you a warning message beforehand, you unmute yourself, switch on your video, and begin by stating your name and where you are from. Well, it's a pleasure to introduce Vincent. Vincent's a long-standing colleague from University College London and an active researcher in the CG research program in two projects. His own project, which is the one he's going to speak to today, and also he works on the public good role of higher education in 10 countries project and has published in that area in relation to France. So a very erudite and much published scholar. Vincent, he's a reader in history of education at UCL, and associate editor of the London Review of Education. His comparative research on the historical relationship between educational systems, contrary of cycles in economics and social change, is located at the interface of history of education and political economy. His research explores the long-term connections and tensions between funding, equity, and quality in higher education at both national and global levels. We look forward to your presentation, Vincent, and the screen is now yours.
Thank you, Simon, for this kind of introduction. So I'm going to share my screen now. Should work.
We can see that. Thanks, Vincent.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so thanks again, Simon, and welcome everyone. I mean, it's a pleasure to be able to share this research, which, as Simon indicated, is part of my CG research project on the historical expansion of higher education system. And today I wanted to talk specifically about something that is work in progress. So please bear with me. I mean, I think it's a great moment for me to be able to share this data because as I'm going to show you, I mean, it takes a while to do some quantitative history and to compile all the data that I'm going to show, and I'm in the process of analyzing it. So it would be great to have like feedback from you. So I'm interested in what student mobility and the transformation of higher education system in France and the UK since the 1920s. that's quite an ambitious title. I realize now that I'm reading it. The transformations of higher education system are very plural, and I'm not going to deal with all of that, but I'm going to do my best to engage with some of the key aspects, relationship between inward student mobility and higher education system. So just as a preamble and an introduction, I mean, I'd like to just to start by just like saying that we are at a juncture and a very important moment to reflect on higher education and its internationalization. And I always tend to start my kind of analysis by looking back to the 2008 crisis. And in relation to that topic of student mobility, I'd like to suggest that student mobility is doubly affected since 2008 by a crisis of globalization and also a crisis of the funding of HE system. They both have been revealed by the crisis. They've been unresolved since then. And, as we have seen, these key tensions have been exacerbated by COVID-19. So internationalization and student mobility, but also higher education system, I would argue, are challenged from different directions. The first kind of challenge is actually the question of the extent to which they have or they could have done more in addressing the growing inequalities within and between countries, which have been revealed by the 2008 crisis. Another one is, another challenge is also, I would say, linked to as a backlash from the 2008 crisis. Internationalization and mobility are challenged by a growing focus on immigration, question of emerging neo-nationalism, and there's been some work by Roger and Douglas on this aspect, and the key question that have been developed now on welfare nationalism, which is linking funding and nationality in some ways, and reforming welfare states in that direction. The third challenge, which is not linked to the 2008 crisis, is the environmental issue, of course. So there's been a lot of debate on internationalization and student mobility, questioning whether internationalization can be corrected, transformed, reimagined, even reversed or discontinued. And some work as well to try to reflect on the way to develop a sustainable cosmopolitan higher education system. And Simon have done some work on that. So this is, I think, an insight us to connect to the old debate and relating to the connection and the clashes between the rationales behind student mobility, and especially this dimension of the kind of dominance of the economic rationale in some ways. It incites us as well to think about the articulation and tensions between the global, national, and the local, and to continue to progress to this idea that internationalization is beyond the response to globalization, a process with intention and consequences, and as a result, acknowledging the agency and responsibility of HE system and institutions. So by that, I'd like to contribute to this by looking historically, looking historically at the relationship, the long-term relationship between higher education system and mobility. I propose here to look back at and compare the trends, the pattern and structure of higher education system in the UK and France since the 1920s. So my plan today is to talk about first of all, to look at the UK context and what are the debates in relation to student mobility and higher education system, with a focus on the political economy. Then talking about France and this idea of the French Republican model and how it's linked to the question of mobility as well, and what are the kind of debates in relation to that. I would then just like present my approach and the data, and then present like a series of kind of findings from the fieldwork, which are about the expansion, the intensity of mobility, also to work on the idea of what are the historical layers of rationale behind mobility, then focus on political economy and scholarships in both countries, then to look at provision and subjects and to see how the dynamic of international student mobility and higher education system work in that relation. And then I will talk about how inward mobility and institutional differentiation work. So just, briefly to set the scene, the idea of the higher education system and the debate about the higher education system and inward mobility in the UK context. That's a long story, long debate in the UK, and it's very important to distinguish between the nations because there are differences in the way the systems are run and higher education is run within the foundation in some ways. Then it's important to have in mind the idea that the higher education system in the UK has been transformed. There's been a transition from a binary system to a unified system in 1992 and policy of marketisation after 1998. This will have important implications for student mobility there. So there's been long debate about the tensions between international fees and state subsidies, and this idea of what should be the right balance and how should reflect the various economic, geopolitical, cultural, and financial rationales. Historically, for example, if we look at the Robbins report in 1963, the subsidized for international student was considered at the time as a justifiable foreign aid. But fees were eventually introduced in 1967 and increased to full cost for non-EU EEC at the time students in 1981. The UK joined the EEC in 1973. So since then, there's been ongoing debate on rationales, policies, practices behind internationalization and the effect on global and national justice. The debate also about the system and its mobility includes the effects of international fees. Also, people like Tannock talking about the consequence of international students falling outside of collective demands for educational equality, as well as debate and about the student experience as immigrants in some ways, and also debates about the system will link to the idea of the financial dependence of universities, whether there's an over-reliance on fees, for example, but also pedagogies, internationalization of the curriculum. So beyond the access, about experience and success in some ways. Myself, done some work, which I'm going to present as well on that, question about whether international fees were playing a role of additional resources or were substitutive resources for public funding, which is an important aspect because it's not only about access, but it's about extra resources to provide support as well for students. Other questions are linked with the idea of student mobilities and whether it has an impact on resource differentiation between institutions and whether differentiation, institutional differentiation leads to a stratification of access to international students. And Aline Courtois has done some work about on this as well. Closer to us, there's been some debate about 2008 crisis, and one of the key debates has been this tension between the income generation agenda and immigration policy. Of course, another kind of newcomer in the debate was Brexit and the impact of the shift from EU student to from home to international student. And finally, there's been some debate about COVID-19, this question of whether COVID-19 has underlined or not the vulnerability of marketized and internationalized system. The debates in France, in a way, are quite different. Key debates from the literature, if we want to look at literature on student mobility in France, they traditionally focus more on the idea of post-colonial factors, Francophonie, also a lot on immigration with Slama, which is like a very used part of literature on immigration and internationalization. More recently, there's been like some more debate on the fact that internationalization is increasingly associated in France to policy towards autonomy and marketisation. And this has been like, there's been some debate of whether this could reshape the equalitarian ideal, of a Republican model of higher education and the idea of public service. And that's something we've researched with Aline Courtois. And we show that there was like, a strong ideal of a Republican model of higher education and the idea of a public service of higher education in some ways. That was like in tension with some practice and reforms that were taking place. So, for example, Ayman and de Gaillardon have shown in a recent paper how competitive funding and merger have been like debated in France, and that there is an increased shift towards what Christine Lucin called the international model, which is about concentrating resources toward world-class universities accessing league tables. And there's been a lot of debate of whether this could be a threat to the principle of the Republican model of equality between institutions. And RRE have done some work on that. One of the key debates recently have been the introduction of fees. So for non-EU international students in mobility, in universities, because fees exist in other higher education institutions. That's important to note. And this has been like seen by some as a major departure from the French Republican model, based on free and non-selective access to universities. Criticism of the reform has been like the idea that, like the competitive funding and merger I was talking about, this has a potential to further widen the existing inequality of resources between universities. So the second criticism were about this idea that it could weaken the contribution of a French system to global social justice, this idea of contributing to widening participation beyond the borders, and also diminishing its influence abroad, especially in the Francophone world. So there is this kind of idea that it may actually lead to different kind of recruitment by university, which were considered until now as the widening participation the institutions for home students, but also for international students. Other kind of suggestion was that it could pave the way for future home fees, as it's been observed in the UK, where it started with fees for international students, and then cost sharing was implemented for home students. So it's quite a polarized kind of debate, where some people see the fees as saving the Republican model because of the funding problem, while overseeing as actually destroying that model. So it's interesting to note that there's been some critics of the reform from very different constituency, and that includes students and staff unions. Also some university with, even in management, they've got the power to waive fees, and some university have decided to waive fees and not to apply the reform, for example. And then the Constitutional Council blocked the reform and because was judging it unconstitutional. And then after like a review of the reform and the idea of scholarship, they decided that the amount of the fees was not like compromising the idea of quality of access in universities. So quite polarized in some ways. So if you look at the debate in the two countries, my suggestion would be that the questions that are regarding inward student mobility are not peripheral, but that at the heart of the dilemma that of HE system in both countries. So what I propose to explore here is to examine the historical dynamics between the trends of expansion and institutional differentiation of HE system in both countries and the trends of inward student mobility. So I will look first at the trajectory of expansion, the intensity, political economy, teaching provision, and then institutional differentiation. I propose to contribute to historical analysis of student mobility, and it's very important that De Witt and Merz did work on this, and Peraton has done like very important work in terms of providing like quantitative data and historical data that needs to be noted. So my objective here is a reasoned use of history. I'm not like thinking that history repeats itself, or I'm going to be like more on the cautious side, like taking some lessons from history that that can help us to understand the current mechanism at place. So my data are new historical data sets on the long-term dynamics of inward student mobility and expansion, transformation, and institutional differentiation of higher education in both countries. So in that, I'm complementing the work of Peraton that I mentioned before. That was like more, these data were like by decade. So I've decided to go for annual historical data sets, which took quite a bit of time to gather and to process. I use the methodology of quantitative history. It's a system of collecting and processing data which provide homogeneous statistical theory comparable across time and space. And it's important because there are different systems, so I had to actually process the data to make them comparable in some ways. The database, I'm going to use the number of international students. They will be disaggregated according to their origins, country, regions. I will also disaggregate them by mode and level of study, full-time, part-time, undergraduate, postgraduate disciplines, and then by institution. So I will make a distinction between university, grandes écoles, and other kind of higher education institution in France and the UK, with distinction between polytechnics and university before 1992 and between post-1992 university, which are the ex-polytechnics, pre-1992 universities, which are the traditional universities. And I will also make a distinction between the Russell Group, which is the elite research university group, and the other pre-19 university. So quantitative data allows to focus on trends, patterns, and structure, and trying to make like some idea of various trends over the years and making like an idea of some kind of correlations, etc. The limitation is it's not a qualitative data. So, I'm really take very seriously Lohmer's remark that using regions as an indicator tends to essentialize students, and Risby and Lingard idea that we can be trapped in a set on nation-centric assumption, and as well like Simon idea that individuals or groups are rarely considered. So I'm not. I really take on board this kind of idea, and I think that's important. But the kind of quantitative work like I do is combined with qualitative qualitative work as well to look at the experience rather than only data. Okay, so I'm going to, before I show you the statistics of enrollment, I'm going to, first of all, look at the methodology in some ways, but it's more than methodology, and that's why I call it when methodology meets policy. I mean, there's a lot of terms that we use, like foreign student, international student, home student, EU, non-EU, and it's important to get in mind like the differences between the two countries, for example, and differences in recording and defining international students. So basically, there's a key distinction between mobility and nationality. And again, beyond technicalities, this distinction often reflects political consideration and regarding, for example, immigration or finance and that kind of politics. So it's important to take that on board. The UK focus on mobility. So international students are foreign. What I mean by that is that foreign residents with settled status and refugees are considered home students, while in France, until 2013, the focus was on nationality, and foreign resident and refugee were considered international students. And you can see that on the right, on the graph, where you've got the foreign student in mobility, it's the square here, and the foreign student who are permanent residents, who are quite stable on the era. But if you look at the as a percentage, that represents quite a lot, up to 35% of students in early 2000. Okay, so that there's been like a shift in 2013 after that period. And all my data will take that on board, is foreign resident with French secondary education diploma being recorded as home student. So that's a big shift. That's what Slama called the end of statistical illusion of international students with different journeys, where actually in the same in the same kind of idea of international student in France, you had some very different journeys, kind of in some ways, between people who were actually resident in France, maybe some of them since they were born, and student in mobility. So that's a significant move in relation to that. That's a significant room in terms of numbers as well, because it explains first that the figures of France until 2013 are overestimated compared to the one in the UK. And the other thing is that explains the recent decrease of international students in France that you will see in the graph that I'm going to show. Okay, so just this graph shows at the top, you've got the UK home student and the French home student. And at the bottom, you've got the UK international student and France international student. So there's a few things to, there's a few comments coming from this graph. First, you've got a considerable rise in the HE systems, but also the number of international students. What's striking as well is they have the same shapes in some ways in the long term. So you've got like a kind of a correspondence between the trends between the two, although you've got some difference that we're going to see later. So what you can see from that is, although, as I said, there are changing difference in methodology, and France might be overestimated, you've got France recruiting more students than Britain until the 1980s. And up after the 1990s, clearly Britain leads and will never be caught up by France. And what you can see as well is significant fluctuation in both countries. And they are often, but not always, synchronized. So if you have a look at this graph, I would call that like it's a radiography of, in a way, what happened in both countries, but also in the world. So in that, you've got periods of economic growth, crisis, war, peace. You've got migration, nationalism, welfare system, neoliberalism, imperialism, decolonization. So you've got a lot of changes over the period. What's interesting is you've got fluctuation which appear to be sharper for international student than home student, and he says this is taking place especially during wars and crises, suggesting that international students absorb shocks in some ways. In relation to economic crisis, you had a particularly negative impact in France in the 1930s, and in the UK during the 1980s, and straight after the 2008 crisis, but it would be only short term. Okay, so you've got like a lot of kind of fluctuation, considerable rise over time, but important fluctuation. Then if you have a look at what I call intensity, which I use as a proxy, the proportion of international students in overall enrollment, that's a proxy that needs to be interpreted like very carefully, because it's the result of the dynamics of home and international students. So higher or lower intensity can mean very different things. You can have like a higher intensity that is caused by actually a slowdown of home students, which happen. What the intensity shows you is a substantial presence of international students over the whole period. You've got like what you can call the golden age in France after the 1900s until the Great Depression. I will explain later what are the drivers behind that. And then you've got like this uninterrupted rise in intensity after the 1990s, reaching like 22% of enrollment today. What's interesting in looking at transformation of higher education systems and mobility is that the massification of the 1960s in both countries explains actually a decrease of the intensity in both countries. That means the massification of the 1960s was not like followed by an increase of internationalization as intense as the increase of home students. The second phase of massification, 1980s, is different and coincided with an increase of inward student mobility in both countries, but especially in the UK. I'm now interested in the structure, and I'm being careful here of not linking too much rationale and regions. So I'm going to talk about like a periodization of international mobility in both countries, and how the structure of international mobility by region have been transformed and sometimes is connected or not with rationales. So what's interesting is you've got a first era, which is from 1890 to 1945, where you still have like elite systems in both countries, but you've got very different dynamics. The dynamic of France is, for example, based on students from Eastern Europe, and you can see the data here. That's the triangles, the black triangle here, and you can see that just before 1970s, you got about 65% of students coming from Eastern Europe in France. I think about 50% of them are from Russia. And of course, 1917 will change this. And after that, you've got like students from Poland, Serbia, and Romania. So interestingly, it's Eastern Europe student that dominates French inward student mobility before 1945, and the second group is a student from Western Europe. So it's really based on a European dimension at that time. On the contrary of the UK, which is at the time like still based, and you can see that with the kind of region as well, and especially Asia and Africa in the 1930s as well. You've got like a dominance of students coming from the British Empire. The 1945 period to 1980s is the construction of a post-war national system of higher education in both countries, and what you got during that time is new dynamic as well, which is post-imperial, post-colonial kind of dynamics, and the Cold War. The impact on France is clearly the collapse of the proportion of students from Eastern Europe at the time, and an increase of students from colonial or post-colonial empire dynamics in France. You've got in the UK an increase of students coming from Asia, and mainly at the time India. So you've got a change. You've got the same dynamic, but an acceleration of that movement. The period from 1980s to 1999, it's, I would say, impacted by the long recession and the impact of the long recession, which in both countries, and you can see that here in France and the same in the UK, you've got a scale back of inward student mobility at the time, and you've got the development of a more measure towards like immigration control, and this is the period as well of Europeanization, where you've got an increase of the proportion of students from Europe, to up to 20% in France. But if you look at the UK, we're talking about 55%. So that's a clear, period of Europeanization at the time, and kind of shift in the dynamic. 1998 will be as well like a shift for both countries, where actually you've got an alignment of rationale. First, you've got Europeanization peaking in both countries. You can see in 2000 here at 30% in France and like 55 in the UK. And at the same time, you've got still numbers of students from European increasing, but far slower than it was. But you've got this being complemented by a dynamic of globalization, and you can see like in both countries an increase of the student from Asia at that time. So it's a kind of golden age in a way, where all the rationales are aligned. It can be rationale of soft power, it can be rationale of cost sharing or income generation in the case of the UK, and clearly that is like a kind of golden age of mobility at the time. After 2008, you start like having like some tensions and the crisis of globalization that I was talking about, and some tensions between income generation and immigration policies. And you can see that although in France you've got like some clear kind of fluctuation in numbers, you have like at the same time UK a strong progression, but a change in the dynamics. I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to move from that. So the idea is you've got like some really big structural changes in there, and you've got various rationales. Just to give you an idea about the political economy as well, and some links between the question of fees for international education and the political economy of higher education. You've got here the kind of the line at the top, you've got the public funding as a share of income of higher education in the UK. And you can see that in 1970, 90% of income is coming from public funding. It's about 20% now. Well, we know that some of the fees are not going to be paid, so that number should be higher in some ways, but it's still like a collapse of the proportion of that. What you can see in there is a dynamic that is changing between the contribution of home student and international student to the increase of fees over time. And here you can see the contribution of international student as a share of all fees, and you can see some interesting kind of dynamic and flexibility. So what's interesting is it started in 1973, and you've got like since then a kind of alternation of who's driving the fees dimension between the two. I'm just going to just to show you the dynamic between mobility and teaching. And what you can see here is basically, I'm not going to read all of that. What you see here is more about change than, more about continuity rather than change. And what you can see in, for example, the proportion of international students who are undergraduate, international students who are full-time, you can see actually that there is more stability within the international student body than the home student body. And over the long term, you can see some adaptation between the two. What you can see as well is the high representation of doctoral students who are international in France, which is about 40% of doctoral students in France are international. At the same time, you can see the high representation of international students in postgraduate studies in the UK, about 40%. So there's been some dynamic of change, but at the same time, if you look over 40 years or something, the changes are not that huge. Just, I think I'm going to do 2 slides and then stop because I'm conscious of the time. So here it's just an indication of scholarships, and I've decided in there to choose government scholarship. I know there's scholarship from institution and other kind of association, but these are government scholarship like the Chevening and Commonwealth in the UK, and one mean tested and one non-mean tested in France. What you can see is the same kind of evolution in some ways. What's I would say notable is that you've got a disconnect between the number of international students and scholarship over the years. Clearly, it's a very small proportion of scholarship compared to the number of international students there. What you can see is the more you the system are marketed, the less generous they are. So the UK system at the moment less generous than it was in the 2000s and the 1960s. The 2000, where soft power rationale and income rationale worked together at the time of the Prime Minister initiatives. At the time, you could think that it's the most dynamic kind of period. What's problematic in France is that scholarship for students in mobility are not means tested. The only means tested scholarship are for students who are foreign residents, which is good news at the national level, but doesn't like bring more mobility and run the risk of social stratification. I'm just going to finish by institutional differentiation, and just to say that it's quite clear that in both countries, there's a link between institutional differentiation and mobility. University sector in France has always been and remains the key recipient of international students, but it has left space to other segments of the system. So, for example, you had 90% of international students were enrolled in university in 74 and 67% today. So what happened is you've got 2 phases. Like the first one is in the 1970s, where you've got like growth of internationalization outside universities. with business schools, some grandes écoles and higher technical schools. The second phase in the 2000s is much more, much bigger, and involve the private sector and for-profit private sector as well, which has raised some issue about social stratification. So the question I raise here is whether the introduction of fees in universities is going to change the student composition of the universities, and whether what some people think their global social justice mission might be hindered in the process in some ways. In the UK, there's a strong link as well with student mobility and institutional differentiation. 70% of international students in university were in university during the binary system. The intensity was like 15% of students in university at the time were international students, while it was only 5% in polytechnic. Interestingly, the unification of the sector in 1992 boosted the number of international students of ex-polytechnics. And there has been like a reduction of the gap. What you can see from both kind of graph is the gap is increasing again. It has increased after the first wave of marketisation, and also, and especially following the end of student number control after 2012. So the increase of the gap between Russell Group universities and the others. So you can see that it's about 35% of international students, again for like 25 and 18 for the post-92 university. So again, you raised some question about my country, whether this might contribute further. I'm going to stop now, and we'll be happy to take some questions.
Well, thank you very much, Vincent. I mean, that's very rich, and there's a lot there for us to chew over. Not much time to talk about it, but let's see what we can do. I'm going to start with a sort of macro question. The long-term shifts in mobility really obviously around geopolitical events. If you could call the Great Depression a geopolitical event, I think, because it was so pervasive and so deep, and changed the politics of the world very much. But you know, the big things have been the wars, of course, and you see these, you know, massive shifts, and to a lesser extent in the deep recession as well. You know, at the end of the 2000s, you see that shifts taking place. The question really is about now. I mean, I'm sure you're thinking about this. I'm thinking about this. Lots of people are thinking about this. We seem to be entering into a new period. I mean, we've had 30 years of internationalisation and globalisation, which has greatly impacted higher education and mobility flows, has encouraged mobility to grow continually, even though arguably the economic globalisation through trade and foreign investment flows slowed down after the Great Recession, after the recession of 2008 to 10. The educational globalisation continued. You know, the international students' mobility has continued to grow year by year until the pandemic, and showing every sign that it could return to its pre-pandemic state fairly quickly in the next year or two. But we've now got a new geopolitic which I think you could say might have begun with Brexit, and that interrupting the student flows between West Europe and the UK, but also is, you know, manifest in the tensions between China and the US. You know, there's major research partners at world level, and now, of course, we have the war in Ukraine and mobility in the Russian and post-Soviet zone completely affected by that. Ukraine itself, not a small country, and increasingly, perhaps we're looking at a situation where global integration and convergence will be reversed by geopolitical changes. The British Academy has just announced a call for bids around global disorder as a social science topic for research. So we're, you know, they think we're in a new period as well. What do you think is going to happen to student mobility in the light of the geopolitical shifts we're now seeing?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks a lot, Simon. Well, it's difficult to predict, and I think that's my that's what I would say in relation. That's what I thought it was interesting to do this. To look at the evolution of rationale around history and to look about this, this graph that shows you how things change, quite regularly. So my idea is what it shows you historically is that there's instability in some ways. It depends what you mean by instability, whether it's decades or, but the variation of rationales means that it's very difficult to predict. And something that I haven't said is you've got an acceleration of instability now. That wasn't the case. The rationale I was talking about, the colonial one, the kind of, they were like straight Cold War, they were straight, they were structural in some ways. While I think now, what it raised the question of instability, and for me, it raised the question of vulnerability, which is a word I should have employed, because I think I prefer it than resilience in some way, because it's a different one, but this idea that higher education system, mobility, institution and students are more and more vulnerable. So my guess is there's going to be change in the light of what you're saying, which is geopolitical change at the moment. The questions I raise is, and that's where I would link it to funding, is the fact that less and less public funding is invested in systems and in mobility as well, including scholarship, means that it's very difficult for systems and institutions to adapt to the changes we're talking about. So, my view is there is going to be some key changes. The problem is how the institutions are going to cope with that in relation.
Yes, well, that's right, and given that, as you say, a lot more of it's unregulated now, and it's going to depend what's happening in global civil society, so to speak, in the aspirations of families and students, and in on the supply side in institutional provision. So we have a more kind of spontaneous world, less scholarship driven, more.
And my view is that public funding would have been like what some people would say demarketized, which is like trying to slow down the kind of public-private substitution, is the best way to ensure that the stability and that the unpredictable can be actually managed at the systemic level and the institutional level. Yeah. And in relation to what you just said, I waited a bit until Sunday evening to know what I was going to say about international student in France, because the result from the election would have been like a kind of major kind of impact on as well what policy could have been in the future.
Well, we rely on the good political sense of France to preserve us from the worst of the next few years, and thank goodness Macron was re-elected for that reason. It's just hard to contemplate the lurch downwards that would have occurred if Le Pen had been elected, the open possibilities that would have suggested for the whole of Europe. And I think we should move to more of the discussion. And Zach Spire has come in first. So Zach, can you come in now, please?
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Good morning. Thank you very much, Dr. Carpentier, for this amazing presentation. It was brilliant. My question is primarily aimed at how do you think these sharp changes, particularly recent events, as you note, continued reduction in public funding of higher education, affects the mobility and ultimately the ability of students to move to more residential models of university, and whether or not you think kind of how these changes in mobility affect the residential model of a university in the next, say, 5, 10, 20 years? Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. Well, you're a specialist on that, so I'm sure you know better about the answer to me. But I will link that again to this idea of public funding, which is related to this idea of mobility and increasing mobility, linking to scholarship, and as well a kind of dynamic of public funding to support students, and that includes residential accommodation and I think it would be important that some provision is devoted to that purpose. So yeah, I think as part of student experience, I think that's key, that there is to develop like some more policies towards that.
Simon Chattopadhyay, can you come in, please?
Yes, yeah. So thanks, Professor Marzinson, for giving me the opportunity. And Vincent, it's a very rich analysis, extremely rich data, and a very good coverage of all the issues historically, I must admit. Vincent, I have got 4 issues in my mind. I was wondering to what extent, I mean, when I'm looking at the historical data, what were the possible factors which determine the choice making of the international students, France vis-a-vis UK? And these 4 factors are the reputation of the universities in the 2 countries. Secondly, the fees which were levied on the international students compared to UK compared to France. I mean, did fees imposed on the international students play an important role in influencing the choices exercised by the students? And the third and the fourth factor are the language of instruction. So the French vis-a-vis English. So being an Indian, I would like to think that, I would like to study in UK because of the language rather than France. So to what extent language of instruction and how it has changed over the years? Is there any policy was there any policy in France to change from French to English, or was it an issue at all? And the fourth issue is the visa regime. To what extent the 2 governments, the France and UK, use the visa regime as to facilitate and foster international student mobility. So these 4 factors are somehow.
Sorry, the fourth one, Somen?
Huh?
The fourth factor, so.
The visa regime.
Okay.
The 2 countries, how the visa regime, how did the 2 countries respond to or to facilitate and foster the international student mobility? Has there been any change in the visa regime in the recent years? And if you look at historically, was it an issue at all? If I go back into the history.
Thank you, Somen. So just to start with the visa regime and immigration policy, at the beginning of the era, it was not like it's in the 1980s, but it started to be very important, the visa policy, immigration policy in relation to that. Up to now, actually, where it's like you can see that because of the post-study work being allowed again, you've got the number of Indian students in the UK has increased like dramatically after having been reduced like very much so. I'm sure you know about that. And yeah, so visa immigration policy, it's absolutely key. And that's quite interesting to see it like coming back. So 1980s was a key era. Then you've got from that until 2008, you've got to pause with that. The language is a very important one, especially in France, because, for example, one of the reasons you had like a lot of students from Eastern Europe at the time was because French was the kind of language used by mostly the elite of the cultural language used at the time. But France, in relation to attract different students as well outside Francophonie, have developed. It was illegal to teach in French until quite recently. The legislation has been changed, and there has been some courses in France, and the kind of compromise was that there should be as well some extra courses to teach international student French as well, not in relation to their own topic, but aside the courses. So you can think that in relation to the increase of fees, there's going to be an increase of courses in English for us recently. But it's a very good example of a not clash, but rationale, like the soft power rationale, the francophone rationale, some income rationale, or some people saying we can do both, but it's a good example.
Yeah, and it's striking that more than one rationale has been associated with rapid growth. I mean, you look at China, for example, the way it's become a big provider, and it hasn't been commercially driven. It's been soft power driven primarily, especially in relation to Africa and Southeast Asia. Japan also, spurts of growth which haven't been associated with the market, but have been associated with the Japanese policy of building internationalisation for domestic purposes. Mm-hmm. So I think we've got time to bring in Christina Cavallo. So for the last question, Christina, please come in.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Vincent, for this really rich data and deep historical and political economy analysis in both countries. My question is quite simple: is which the proportion of the international students in England related to the other UK countries?
Ooh, that's a good. I don't have a figure in mind, but I think Scotland got like a higher intensity than England in some ways, but I would not be able to. I would guess like 90% of the enrollment is in the UK. But I think from what I remember from the figures I've seen is like Scotland has a higher intensity. But because of the size of the English system, I could say like most international students would be in England. But the rest of the country is very international as well.
Okay.
Several formations. Yeah.
Thank you. Nice to see you. Thank you so much.
Bye. Bye.
Vincent, I mean, the graphs are really brilliant. I mean, they're so clear, and they raise so many issues, and your notes on them also, eliminate those issues. And so I think we'd all greatly benefit from seeing it all in print as soon as you can. So, maybe in a short working paper, which just summarizes what you said today, would be really widely appreciated and create great interest. And I think people will watch the YouTube version to try to unpick some of those trend lines and think about causation. It's fabulous what you can do with historical data, isn't it? I mean, so suggestive in relation to the present, and so helpful in so many ways. So thank you for doing it so well. And we look forward to further contributions from you in future, and especially this long-term data mapping that only you are doing, in this way. And which is of such wide interest. Our next webinar, folks, is we're back with UK higher education governance and Alison Wheaton's project, and she's got to the end of her doctorate, so she's now presenting her sort of summations and final thoughts on her study, influences on and dimensions of English university governing body roles, on Thursday at 2:00 UK time. We look forward to seeing you all then. Vincent, thanks again, and welcome back, of course, in future with more data as soon as you have it for us. And so it remains for me to say to everyone, bye for now, and see you in 2 days.
Thank you all. Thank you, Simon. Bye.